Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Alethea Baptist Church Sunday morning enrichment hour. This morning we're going to be discussing our Sunday school lesson. Today's lesson comes out of 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13. The title of today's lesson is Concern for a Weaker Brother. Paul is going to address one of the concerns that they was having at the church at Corinth. And one of the problems they was having was about eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols. And so, but remember, in first century Corinth, this was a polytheistic society in that they worshiped many gods. And so Paul was going, and some of the people at Corinth had a problem because they would bring a lamb, offer sacrifice, then they would take some of the meat, and then they would have a sacrificial meal. And then some of them would sell into the marketplace where everyday citizens could buy this meat. And some of them had issues with buying this meat that had been offered and sacrificed to idols. So Paul was going to address this issue in this lesson today, starting in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. And he says, "Now, as touching things offered unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge." And when he said we all have knowledge, because some thought it was okay to eat this meat, others thought it was not okay to eat this meat. So they all had knowledge, but the point was that they all had a measure of understanding, but they was at different levels of their spiritual maturity. And so Paul going to address this issue, but before he addressed the issue, he's going to teach a very important lesson here. And notice what he doesn't do here. He doesn't commend, nor does he condemn. But he's going to teach a lesson here. And as we go through this lesson, what we're going to see here, that the real issue is not even the idol or not even the meat. The real issue here was their behavior toward one another and how they were reflecting God. And so that's why Paul is going to teach this lesson. And that's also a lesson for us to understand too, because, see, the enemy is behind this. See, the enemy will come along, he'll bring along all of these issues to pull us away from what's the true issue that what is at hand. And that was happening here, and that was happening in the culture today. The enemy bring along all of these side distractions to distract us, to mislead us, misguide us, to pull us away from the true issues. And that's why he's going to teach this very important lesson here. And he's going to begin. And so that's why he said, he began to teach the lesson, he said that we know that we all have knowledge. And then he said, knowledge puffs up, but charity edifies. Now, edify means, the word means to construct, to build. So what it's saying there, but charity, which is love, it builds up. So that's why in verse 2, he says, he makes this statement because he's teaching a lesson. He says, if any man think that he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing, yet as he ought to know. Why? Because he's teaching this lesson, he's contrasting knowledge with love. See, knowledge will cause one to become pride, arrogant, and selfish, whereas love will cause one to have concern and compassion for someone else. That's why over in chapter 13, verse 1, he made this statement. He said, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels. No, great knowledge, wisdom, but if I don't have love, I have become a noisy gong, a clanging cymbal. In other words, he's saying, I'm just talking loud and saying nothing. And if you don't understand this principle of knowledge and love, you don't know nothing. And then he goes on in verse 3, he says, but if any man love God, the same is known to him. Now, notice that this is a conditional statement. And you may ask this question, what's love got to do with it? Everything. Because when he says, but if, this is a conditional statement, and he said it's not how much knowledge that we have that we are approved or that we are known by God, but it's how much love we have for God and how much love we have for one another. Because the issue here, they bring it up here, it's not even about the meat and it's not about the idols. The real issue is about behavior and how they was relating to one another and how they was reflecting God. And so when he says that And I said, this is a conditional statement. And he says that if any man loves God, that's why in John chapter 13, verse 35, he says, by this, all men will know that you are my disciples. In other words, that I know you if you have love one for another. So when you say, what's love got to do with it? Everything. Because it's not how much knowledge we have that we're known by God. It's how much love we have that we're known by God. And if you don't understand this principle, you don't know nothing. You just a noisy gong, a clanging cymbal, just talking loud and saying nothing. And the reason he was contrasting the difference between knowledge and love, because back in chapter 2, he made this statement. He said, now, when I came to you, I didn't come to you with superiority of speech and of wisdom, but I came proclaiming to know nothing but Jesus Christ and him crucified. And the reason being because Paul was an educated man, but he didn't want them to be caught up in his great oratorial skills, his great knowledge and wisdom, and nullify the cross on by which they were saved. So no, it was not about the knowledge, it was about the love. And that's why he said, and if you don't understand this principle, you just talking loud and saying nothing. Now, and keep in mind, it's the enemy is behind this. And so notice now, they are focused on two issues, and that's not even the problem. They focus on idols, and they're focusing on meat. Now, in verse 4, he's going to begin to address this issue. And he's going to start with the wicked brothers first. And he says, as concerning therefore eating of those things that are offered in sacrifices unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world. That an idol is nothing in the world, and there is but one God. Now, notice I said he focused on the wicked brothers first. He's telling them, now, idols, they are nothing. But he don't just only tell them that an idol is nothing. He's going to go on and explain to them why idols are nothing. Because there is but one God. See, when Paul established this church in Corinth in Acts chapter 18, he spent 18 months there teaching and preaching in Corinth. Then after he left, Apollos came in. He spent time there preaching and teaching. And they had been taught that there's only one God who created the heavens and the earth and everything that is in it. And therefore, idols were nothing. They had no real existence. So in essence, it's telling them, you can't sacrifice to another God because there's only but one God. And he's going to explain this issue. But then I really like what he says here in verse 5, because remember, he's trying to encourage these weaker brothers and sisters, trying to build up their understanding. And so he says, he's going to tell them, I understand. Notice what he says here, for though there be that are called the gods, whether in heaven or in earth, as there be many gods and many lords. Now, remember, in first century Corinth, there was a polytheistic society. They believed in many gods and they worshiped many gods, and that was the norm for them. But the thing that he wants them to understand is, he said when he says that though there be many gods, but there's only one God, and that one God created the heavens and the earth. And the idea he's trying to bring home to them is this, that these gods, they are only figments of their imaginations. They only exist in their own minds. And some that they even created with their own hands. They had made themselves out of silver, gold, wood, stone, and etc. But the idea here, but now let me show something here. The point we're trying to make here. When he says here, for though there be that. You see that? That word signifies things, objects. It's like saying that bench, that chair, that car, that house. No, things and objects. And so what he's saying, these are things that you created, they have no real existence, whereas in verse 4, he said, but there is but one God, definite. So the thing being here is this here, that whereas you yourself made these gods, these are things that are called the gods. They are not gods, they are called the gods. But whereas the one God who created the heavens and the earth and everything that is in it, he is the one God. And so that's the distinction that he's making here. He's trying to build up their understanding by saying that these gods have no real existence. So in essence, you can't sacrifice to another God because there's but one God. And then he's going to really expound on this issue here in verse 6 when he says, but to us. And notice Paul includes himself with this group. He said, but to us, there is but one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we in him. Now, let's break this down. Now, notice what he says here. When he says, for there's but one God, the Father, of whom. That structure, of whom, that means origin. What he says here, all things and everything, including us, have our origin in one God, the Father. And then it says, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom. Notice that structure there, by whom, that means existence. It has the idea of, and what he's saying is that all things and everything exist by Jesus Christ. And so the point he's doing here is that he's establishing the deity of God the Father and God the Son, as opposed to gods and who they created. And they said in everything, it had their origin and everything had their existence in him and by him, including us. And the difference is that these gods in verse 5 that you said that are many that are called it gods, they are really no gods at all. They have no real existence. But this God, because these gods that they had created, they created with their own hands. You cannot create a God. If you created it, how did it become a God? If you created it. But the difference here, but this God, he created the whole universe, including them and everything in it. This is the true God. And so, and this brings to mind Psalms 115, verse 4 to 7, when he talks about, he said, gods that created with that you create your hands made of silver and gold. Though they have mouths, they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they cannot hear. They have noses, but they cannot smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel. They have feet, but they cannot walk. And so the thing is, he established here, there's only one God that has divine and sovereign power, and that is the one God who created the heavens and the earth and everything in it, and including us. And it's by him that we have our existence. So in essence, these so-called gods that they have created, they have no real existence, and they cannot sacrifice to another God. And so he's trying to help them here. But then I like what he does in verse 7. Because remember, he's trying to encourage them. He's trying to build up their faith. And he said, howbeit, there is not in every man that knowledge. Notice that understanding. He said, I understand. Everybody does not understand this. And so he's dealing with the wicked brothers. He's trying to encourage their faith. And then he says, for some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto idols. And so remember, in first century Corinth, this was a polytheist society. They worshiped many gods, and they had a God for everything. And so for them to eat this meat, it convicted them. They had conviction about that because this was the norm. But then when the church came along and they realized that this was wrong, then it had problems. It caused a confusion for them because they could not separate the meat from the idol. They could not understand that the meat was just meat and the idols had no real existence. And so this was causing them problems. And so for them, this one God was just another God of many if they made no distinction. And so they was having problems with this. This was causing them confusion. And so the real issue, so the issue for them was that as long as they ate that meat, they still felt contaminated. They felt morally unclean. They felt defiled because of their conscience. Now, let me talk about conscience. See, now, God created us in his image, and he gave us a conscience. And that conscience is that which supposed to regulate our moral and our ethical behavior. See, God established that morality, and that's why he gave us a conscience, and that's why he gave the law, and that's why he gave rules and regulations to govern their behavior among one another. But the thing here is Paul is teaching that these idols, because this is one of the issues they had, that they have no real existence. And so now in verse 8, now, after he dealt with these, because remember, it was two issues here that they was dealing with here. They had brought up about the idols, and they had brought up about eating of the meat. So now in verse 8, he's going to deal with the meat. And notice what he says here. But meat commended us not to God. Now, the word that commended means to bring together. It means to reconcile. And then so it says, for not if we eat, are we the better, or not if we eat not, are we the worse. And see now, notice, he has dealt with why idols, you couldn't sacrifice to an idol because they had no real existence. But now he's going to deal with the meat, because this was the two issues, the idols and the meat. And he says, but meat cannot commend us to God. So now he's going to affirm that it doesn't matter what we eat, it doesn't really make a difference, because meat cannot bring us to God. It cannot reconcile us to God. It has no real value. So now, notice here, he has dealt with the issue of the idols. He has dealt with the issues of the meat. And like I said early on, see, the real issue here was not even the idols and the meat. And this was Paul trying to get them to understand. The real issue here was their behavior toward one another, and how they was reflecting, and how they was reflecting God. That was the true issue here. And he wanted them to understand. And if you don't understand this principle, just mere knowledge and love, you don't know nothing. You just talking loud and saying nothing. But then in verse 9, he's going to focus now on the stronger brothers. And now he's going to focus attention on them, and he's going to give them a strong warning. Notice what he says here. But take heed, lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. Now, like I said, remember, the true issue here was not eating, and the true issue was not idols. The true issue here was their behavior and how they was relating to one another. And see, now, that's a lesson here for us to understand, too. Our purpose is to bring people to Jesus, a membership in his family, develop into Christ-like maturity. In other words, our purpose is that we should glorify God and bring people to God. That's our purpose. The enemy come along, bring along all these here side distractions to pull you away from the true issue. See, the true issue was with them was their behavior, and they didn't even see it. The true issue was their behavior toward one another and the love they had for one another. And so, but the enemy gets in there, and the same thing that we see happening in the culture today, all these side distractions is going on and has nothing to do with bringing people to Jesus and membership in his family and glorifying God in any way. But we get caught up in all these, and the enemies behind this get caught up in all these side distractions. And so what he's saying is this: if you don't understand this principle of love, you don't know nothing. You just you have become a noisy gong, a clanging cymbal. You just talking loud and saying nothing. And so, and that's why in verse 10, he says he's going to give them an example. Not like this too. Notice what he said: for if any man see thee, which has knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple. In other words, in a public place, a restaurant, eating his meat, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And that word that means emboldened means to be encouraged, to be enticed to do the same thing, even though they felt conviction by this. Their conscience bothered them for doing this here. But yet, he says, if they see you doing this, will they not be encouraged and enticed to do the same thing? So the point he's making here is this: lead by example. Now, that is something that we all can relate to today, leading by example. And that's something that we all should strive to do. Because let's consider this. Think about when you're talking about leading by example. Let's just say today, if there was a pandemic, and thousands was dying every day, and the scientists and the doctors, the people that study infectious disease tell us, look, if you wear a mask, you social distance, avoid gathering in tight spaces, you could save the lives of millions about someone else and not about self. And you know what? There'll be some that say, okay. But then there will be those, oh no, that infringes upon my right. And so I'm going to go where I want, I'm going to do what I want, and I don't care who I hurt in the process. That is mere knowledge. See, mere knowledge, we have to be careful with that because it will bring us to a place where we will have no love, no concern, and no compassion for anyone else other than self. But love will cause us to have compassion and concern for someone else. And that's why he said, look, if you don't understand this, this principle of knowledge and love, you don't know nothing. You just talking loud and saying nothing. And consider this now. In first century Corinth, it was about eating meat. Today, it could be about a pandemic. Tomorrow, who knows? But the principle, the point is this, love. It doesn't matter, because what we know is this, time marches on. Cultures come and go, people come and go, but the principle of love is timeless. It doesn't matter what culture, it doesn't matter what come and go, the principle of love is timeless. It will always have concern and compassion for someone else. And so that's the lesson that he's trying to teach them, trying to get them to understand that love is always the answer, always. And then in verse 11 here, so then he issued them, in verse 11, then he asked them a probing question, and we today must ask ourselves a probing question. Notice it says, and through thy knowledge shall the wicked brother perish for whom Christ died. In other words, because of your personal liberties, because your knowledge will cause you to get puffed up with pride, arrogance, and selfishness, will someone else perish? We have to ask ourselves that same question, that because of our arrogance, are we willing to allow someone else to perish? Now, think about this, and this is a reality. Thousands died during the pandemic, and when millions, thousands could have been saved if people did take this attitude that, well, I don't care who I hurt in the process. It's just all about me and my right. But love will cause you to say, well, you know what? Okay. In order to prevent someone else from perishing, I'd rather give up my liberties for a short time. But no, remember, the enemy is behind this. And the enemy brings along all of these distractions to pull us away from the things that are truly important and get us to focus on self. See, the enemy knows this. If I can get you to focus on self, you forget all about God. And you begin to just only have concern for yourself and no one else. And see, the issue here is not about eating meat. It's not about sacrificing to God. The issue here is about love and the behavior toward one another. And that is still the same issue today. See, all this division we have today is not about doctrine, and it's not about doctrine, and it is not about train of thought, can't find the word I'm looking for. It's not doctrine. Well, anyway, but it's not about doctrine. We're divided today because all of these side distractions that the enemy has shoving at us, and we get caught up in that, and we are turning away from God. Now, in verse 11, and it said, and through thy knowledge shall the wicked brother perish. And that would actually mean to be ruined, to be destroyed, to be terminated, to be cut off. Initially, it literally means to die. And he said, are you willing to do that for your own selfishness, your own arrogance, and your own pride? That's what this question is asking. And we all, if we want to lead by example, we need to ask ourselves that same question. Are we willing to cause someone else to stumble for our own selfish gain? Now, in verse 12, he said, but when you sin so against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. And notice he tells him, now he didn't condemn the weaker brothers, but he talked to these stronger brothers. And he tell them, you are sinning. When you act just selfishly and have no concern, no compassion for no one else, he said, you're sinning. And see, that's why it's so important to understand this principle of love, because if we don't, we just talking loud and saying nothing. And see, and see, the thing about it too, now, this brings to mind 1 John 4:20, when he says that how can you say you love God whom you have never seen, and yet hate your brother whom you have seen? If you don't understand this principle of love, you're just talking loud and saying nothing. And the thing about this is, and he tells them that you are sinning when you're doing this here. But we know that sins can be forgiven. But we also know sins has consequences. Now, we know that we can stray so far away from God that God will actually turn you over to a reprobate mind. And the danger in that is this: if God turns you over, only God can undo it. There's nothing anyone can say or anyone can do to reverse that situation. But there's hope. Though you may be a weaker brother or sister, but as long as you have love, as long as you have concern, as long as you have compassion in your heart, you can fall on your knees, throw your hand in the air, and say, all praise to our God. Why? Because God has not turned you over to a reprobate mind. God is still working on you. Now, you may be coming up on the rough side of the mountain, but you are coming up. Hallelujah. Now, but the point he's making here, he's contrasting this mere knowledge with love. And the point that he's making in this whole thing is not about eating of the meat. It's not about offering sacrifices to these pagan gods. It's all about love. And we cannot let the enemy drag us away, get sidetracked with all of this other stuff, and we forget our true purpose, which is to bring people to God and to have love for one another. And so that's why, and that's why he says that in verse 13, he said, but now wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend. Now that word that to offend, it means to stumble, to act treacherously, to be perverted. And he's saying that if that caused me to sin, then I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. And what Paul's saying is here, because of love. And remember, Christ, he died for us, not because we were good, not because we deserved it, but he did it for love. And Paul's saying the same thing here. For love, I will never eat meat again if it caused my brother to offend, if it caused my brother to stumble, if it caused him to act treacherously, if it caused him to be perverted, I will never eat meat again. Why? Because it's all about love. And if you don't understand this principle, you will never understand, or we will never do the work that God has called us to do. We can't get caught up in all of this side distraction and get pulled away from the true purpose that God has called us to do, and that is to glorify God and bring people to build the church. Now, there may be times when I may need a helping hand. There may be times when you may need a helping hand. That's when love steps in and says, lean on me and I'll be your helping hand. Lean on me and I'll help you carry the load. Concern for the weaker brother. That is our purpose. Now, that concludes our lesson for today. I want to thank all of you here in the sanctuary. I want to thank all of you watching by way of social media, and wishing you all a wonderful and blessed day. Thank you.